Welcome to Season 3 of the Midnight Library of Baseball. The fireplace is crackling in front of me, the books all put away on their shelves. I have a steaming cup of peppermint tea, and I'm ready to go. So let's start with a question. What happens in baseball? I know, it's a big question, but why not start the new season with a whopper? All of you out there probably have 1,000 answers to this question, and they're all correct. But I want to focus on an answer I stumbled upon and which connects to the theme of this episode. And this answer to the question, what happens in baseball, came from, of all people, a philosopher. My guess is that of all sports, baseball contains the highest percentage of philosophers. An elegant explanation for this is that there's so much time in the game to reflect, to ponder, to consider all the questions in the universe. A less elegant way to put it is that players spend a lot of time just standing or sitting around. And in that time, you can fill your head with baseball strategy, grocery lists, or big unsolvable questions. In his book, Infinite Baseball, philosopher Alva Noe does something I love. He takes a topic, turns it on its side, and shakes it. You get these new insights, these tweaks on old ideas. And on the very first page, Noe writes about baseball, quote, "What happens in baseball is less a matter of material facts on the ground than it is a matter of who did what. To play baseball is always to be absorbed in the task of figuring out how to apportion praise and blame." End quote. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, of course. Of course, that's true. All sports, in fact, are about apportioning praise and blame. Who scores a goal? Who threw a touchdown? But when I read this sentence by Noé, and when I kept reading, something clicked in my mind. It's different. Unlike other sports, baseball is all about who exactly did what. And in no other sport is the truth so misunderstood. This theme runs through Noé's book, with some excellent examples. Like Ken Holtzman's 1969 no hitter with the Cubs. Holtzman was a big strikeout pitcher, but in this game, Holtzman struck out 0 batters. Hitters were constantly putting the ball in play, but always in the direction of somebody's glove. So who deserves the credit? Was Holtzman inducing weak ground balls or easy flies? Or were batters hitting bullets, but right at fielders? Or were fielders making spectacular plays? Of his performance that day, Holtzman said, quote, "I can't believe it. I threw about 14 bad pitches and got away with them all." End quote. And yet, in the record books, next to Holtzman and no one else that day is the word no hitter. Let's look at another example. Take the astounding performance of pitcher Harvey Haddix 10 years earlier. In 1959, against the Milwaukee Braves, Haddix had pitched a full perfect game. No hits, no walks, no errors. Except at the end of 9 complete innings, neither team had scored a run. So Haddix pitched 10 perfect innings, and then 11 perfect innings, and then, incredibly, 12 perfect innings. But at the same time Haddix was having this miraculous performance, his teammates could not get him a run. So in the 13th, the Braves broke up the perfect game, the no hitter, the shutout, and Haddix ended up losing the game. He also, by the way, threw 8 strikeouts and hit a single and made it to third base. He pitched 3 more no hit innings than Ken Holtzman, and yet he's not credited with a no hitter or perfect game. Think of a grand slam in the ninth inning to win the game by 1 run. You think of the guy who hit the grand slam, and not about the 3 other men who had to get on base to make it happen. Take sacrifice flies, or bunts, or fielder's choice, or the role of the catcher. When you pause and step back, you start to see all the ways this apportioning of praise and blame is happening at every level of the game. And Noé's words are especially fitting for tonight's episode about the 1919 Chicago White Sox, where the question of blame is prioritized and yet the answer so elusive. The Black Sox scandal of 1919, involving, among others, shoeless Joe Jackson, is a great story. It's farce, it's drama, it's tragedy, it's romance and mystery. It's an American folktale and Greek mythology. The title for this episode is The Greatest Myth in Baseball History. I'm sure there are lots of people who argue about this, but I use this title not for one myth, but the sheer number of myths that swirl around this story. It's like a Russian doll of myths. You open up one and there's another, and another. Myths about what actually happened, myths about reasons behind the cheating, myths about the folk hero aspect of the story. Who are the real villains, and who are the real heroes? And what are the real lessons to take away from this scandal that happened 105 years ago, but is still very much alive? It's a wild ride, so get ready to question everything you think you know about the 1919 Black Sox scandal and the 8 ballplayers banned forever from the game they loved. Or so they would have you believe. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there's no loud music, no jarring sounds, only nostalgic, thought provoking, emotional stories about baseball. Tonight, the greatest myth in baseball history.
As more people looked at the scandal, one, they determined that the Asimov account was flawed and that there was much that needed to be reassessed. And the more you found, the more you wanted to find more.
The owners didn't want to know the extent to which game fixing might be going on. To investigate those rumors and proving them to be true would have been ruinous for the game.
Coming up. If you're a bit rusty on the 1919 scandal, here's briefly what happened. 8 White Sox players were found guilty of accepting money from gamblers to throw the World Series, meaning they deliberately played poorly so that the Cincinnati Reds would win. The White Sox, fielding one of the most talented teams in history, were expected to win in a landslide, but they lost. Eventually, the story came out, players were prosecuted in a criminal court, and were eventually banned from professional baseball for life. One reason I'm fascinated with the Black Sox scandal is how much real estate it takes up today in 2025, more than 100 years later. When you look at the whole pie of baseball history, there are hundreds of thousands of stories sliced up in that pie. But there's going to be one slice bigger than most regarding the 1919 World Series fix. Just doing a quick search on Amazon, I found more than 20 books on or related to the Black Sox scandal, and there are dozens and dozens of articles. For a singular event that occurred during one World Series, why is there so much written about it?
I think that after Eight Man Out was published around 1964, for the next 40 years, that was taken as the definitive account, and there was no need to revisit the scandal.
This is Bill Lamb, a former state prosecutor who turned his skills to investigating the Black Sox scandal. Hi, Bill. Thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, Ben, for inviting me to participate.
In addition to writing many articles, Lamb dove hardcore into the legal side of the scandal in a book titled Black Sox in the Courtroom: The Grand Jury, Criminal Trial, and Civil Litigation. As Lamb explained, the book 8 Men Out, written in the 1960s, and then the film of the same name from the 1980s, shaped people's perceptions of the scandal. But that perception started to change after historian Gene Carney began digging into the legal documents of the trials in 2003. From Bill Lamb.
That started to change in the late 1990s when several writers, including the late Gene Carney, began to re-explore the scandal to determine if there was more to be discovered and more to be said. And I think that for about a 5 year period, Gene Carney devoted his column, which had a significant following, exclusively to the Black Sox scandal. And this in turn stimulated the interest of others. And he was key, of course, to the organization of the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee. And as more people looked at the scandal, one, they determined that the Asimov account was flawed, to be kind, and that there was much that needed to be reassessed about what had happened in 1919. And the more you found, the more you wanted to find more. And that was, I think, the motivation for any number of scandal researchers, including myself.
What happened in the early 2000s could be described as a literature renaissance. Dozens of articles and book after book came out on the Black Sox scandal with new information and detective work, and it's still coming. As Lamb mentioned, the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee was formed, and in 2019, the Black Sox Scandal Symposium took place in Chicago, with hundreds of attendees, presenters, panels, and tours over the course of 3 days. As Lamb later said, this singular event in 1919 spawned an entire subgenre of literature. But there's got to be more, right? In terms of why this 100-year-old event still resonates with so many people? Well, a big part of the reason, I think, has to do with how people in 1919 felt about baseball. It wasn't just the World Series, and baseball in 1919 is not what it is today. I was trying to think of an equivalent today, but there really isn't one. There's no sport that is as pervasive and embedded in American culture as baseball was in the early 20th century. As far back as the 1860s, reporters described the mania of this new sport taking hold. As I mentioned during my barnstorming episode, baseball had the power to stop time, right? That might seem dramatic, but it was true in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Major league teams playing exhibition games turned towns and cities upside down. In his book, Satch, Dizzy, and Rapid Robert, author Timothy Gay writes at length about barnstorming and how big of a deal it was when teams showed up for a game. Quote, when a barnstorming team came barreling through, local leaders declared a holiday. Schools and businesses often closed early. End quote. Can you imagine that today? Oh, the Yankees are coming to play the Nationals, so let's shut down all of Washington, D.C. And on top of that, we'll throw a massive parade, which everyone will attend. But this was the reality in the early 20th century. Baseball was fun, it was communal and individual. It fit the pace of the time. And there weren't many sports to watch. There was no basketball, football was in its infancy, hockey wasn't much of a thing, and boxing was popular, but not in the same way as baseball. There's this great article by Donna Halper titled Before There Was Radio How Baseball Fans Followed Their Favorite Teams, 1912 to 1921. This is a great piece because it really shows you how enthusiastic people were for baseball in the early days, especially considering the constraints. Halper writes about fans standing outside newspaper buildings in the early 1900s, thousands of people, because there was no television, there was no radio, and people from the newspaper would relay information from the World Series in as close to real time as they could get. From Halper, quote, when the newspaper received the latest scores from a telegrapher at the ballpark, a newsboy would write the information on a bulletin board, updating it every inning. Some newspapers also had someone with a megaphone calling out the updates as they were received. In either case, the fans would cheer whenever the news was good or express their disappointment when it wasn't. End quote. And in this article, there's a fantastic photograph of thousands of fans standing outside the New York Herald newspaper building in 1911. And in the background, there's this huge baseball diagram and scoreboard, which people would have operated manually. I just love to see these unexpected examples of people from the past figuring things out based on what was available, things I'd never imagined. Again, they had no YouTube, no streaming, no radio, television. I mean, right now, during football season, you can go to YouTube and see these diagrams of football and baseball fields. And you see these little dots or figures moving across the board, tick by tick. But it was happening in 1911 only by hand. A newsboy would slide the figures on the diagram based on telegraph information. And the emotions of these thousands of people standing on the sidewalk were tied up in these slow, simple movements. Every time the newsboy walked to the diagram, people would have tensed, anticipating his action. And then to see him move the figure from home to first to second, to see other base runners on the board moving toward home, to these people, it was as good as watching a home run at the ballpark. But still, it's kind of funny. As I picture myself observing from a distance, I see a person moving a tiny object on a billboard, and from this simple little action, thousands of people erupt in cheers and shouting and hugging. I also found it interesting what Donna Halpert said about newspapers. During this period, there was a morning, midday, afternoon, and evening edition. That's 4 newspapers per day. And if there was a major sports event, there could be a late night edition. And if there was breaking news, there could be an extra edition. That's 6 newspaper editions in a day. But this article just highlights not only how different the time period was from today, but also how much people cared about baseball. By the 1900s, everybody played baseball. Children played in the fields, in the streets, and soon spacious stadiums were springing up in urban areas. There was a growing middle class, and this, by the way, is the biggest reason why baseball took off, according to author Thomas Gilbert. But people had a bit more money in their pockets and a bit more time for leisure. And baseball was for everyone at every class level. Here's a great line from journalist Edgar F. Wolfe, writing in 1923 about baseball in class. Quote, "Men may be far apart in their stations in life, but that one common interest draws them together in human sympathy. It makes human beings out of those who would otherwise be self-centered fops." End quote. Mark Twain wrote that baseball was, quote, "the very symbol of the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century." End quote. To Twain's point, outside of maybe the gold rush and boxing, baseball was the only area where a poor man could turn himself into a wealthy man and still be illiterate. On the field, you had the full range of social strata, from shoeless Joe Jackson, the illiterate son of a sharecropper, to college graduates like Eddie Collins, and medical students like Doc Archie Graham. Men loved baseball, women loved baseball, and while African Americans were restricted to the Negro Leagues, many African Americans still watched and rooted for Major League players. Part of this had to do with barnstorming leagues, where black and white and Latino and female players came together. When we jump to 1919, the year the White Sox, or some of the White Sox, threw the World Series, baseball was sport. Baseball was cinema and television. Baseball was social media. Baseball was friends, and baseball was family. For many, baseball was also religion, something that helped boost people's morale, something that gave people hope and reassurance. And even though many people privately and openly gambled on baseball, it was still seen as wholesome and pure. I just re listened to an old episode of the Radio Lab podcast. And one of the stories was of this young man who fell in love with a con artist. This couple, they were together for months, if not years. And this guy was in love with this woman before he finally found out she was a con artist. And the lies she told were whoppers. And then after that, he found out how many people she'd done this to, how many people she'd lied to and tricked. This woman left a wake of broken hearts and betrayal behind her. And for this guy, years later, he couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't form new relationships. His world had become the people he'd known before he met the con artist. And I like this example for tonight's story because this woman, this con artist, she let these people fall headfirst into deep, intimate emotional relationships so that when she eventually betrayed them, when she eventually robbed them, they were devastated. I think there's some equivalent here to what happened in 1919, because for thousands upon thousands of Americans, baseball was a deep, intimate relationship. And in their eyes, the 8 men banned from baseball would have been seen as con artists who betrayed them, who lied to them, who broke their hearts. And this kind of heartbreak is universal, 100 or 1,000 years later. In trying to connect 1919 to today, I wanted to make one more quick comparison, and that's with the Houston Astros. In 2020, Major League Baseball conducted an intense investigation, and they found that the Astros had used an elaborate system to steal the opposing team's signs. More importantly, they'd used advanced technology, which was against existing and newly implemented rules. The system was called Codebreaker and was referred to by one Astro as the dark arts. Jared Diamond, writing for the Wall Street Journal, explained the process. Quote, "The way Codebreaker worked was simple. Somebody would watch an in game live feed and log the catcher's signals in the spreadsheet, as well as the type of pitch that was actually thrown. With that information, Codebreaker determined how the signs corresponded with different pitches. Once decided, that information would be communicated through intermediaries to a base runner, who would relay them to the hitter." End quote. I assume by base runner, Diamond meant base coach, because you're not always going to have a base runner. But to relay the type of pitch to the base runner or coaches, Astros players would bang on a trash can, right? They did this in 2017 and 2018. And of course, the Astros defeated the Dodgers in the 2017 World Series. Most Astros either participated or knew about the scheme. And to be clear, a rule about mechanical sign stealing had been in place since 1961, and an update came in 2001. So they knew. Ultimately, the Astros were fined $5 million. General manager Jeff Linnell and team manager AJ Hinch were suspended for a year and then fired. And the team lost its first and second round draft picks for 2020 and 2021. But what happened to the players? Nothing. Nothing at all happened to these players who knew they were breaking the rules, unless you consider public finger wagging a punishment. Now, what if, instead of nothing happening to the players, every person shown to be involved in any way was banned from baseball for life? This is exactly what happened to 8 major league players in 1921, 2 years after these 8 White Sox players were found guilty of throwing the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. Many of you listening may have some knowledge of the Black Sox scandal, but thanks to Elliot Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out, which came out in 1963, and because of the 1988 film of the same name, what most people believe is far, far from the truth. You also probably know Shoeless Joe Jackson from the film Field of Dreams, or the book Shoeless Joe. But this person, too, was based on Asanoff's portrayal. It's like a game of telephone, where you sit in a circle and the first person tells a story to the second person. And as the story goes down the line, details and facts change until the story at the end barely resembles the story at the beginning. That's what happened with Shoeless Joe and the 1919 White Sox. 40 years is a long game of telephone, and it's really hard to set the record straight when the record's been written in stone for 4 decades. But let's give it a shot, starting with one of the biggest myths or misunderstandings about how the 1919 Chicago White Sox players were treated.
The central thesis of the book 8 Men Out and the film is that the Black Sox fixed the World Series because they were so poorly paid and so badly treated by their owner, Charles Comiskey.
This is another expert on the topic.
My name is Jacob Pomrenke. I'm the Director of Editorial Content for SABR, and I'm also the chair of SABR's Black Sox Scandal Research Committee. A book that I edited was called Scandal on the South Side, the 1919 Chicago White Sox for SABR back in 2015.
SABR, by the way, stands for Society of American Baseball Research. And during his research, Pomrenke quickly debunked Azanov's myth.
Comiskey was not a hero in this story, but he was not the supervillain that he's been portrayed as, the Scrooge character that stiffed his players and paid them like the worst team in the American League. In fact, we have the payroll records, we have the salary contract cards now, and it shows that the White Sox were one of the highest paid teams in the league.
But as Pomrenke said, Comiskey was villainized for nearly a century after the scandal. And we're not talking about obscure writers posting on tiny blogs. In his book, Turning the Black Sox White, The Misunderstood Legacy of Charles A. Comiskey, author Tim Hornbaker tried to set the record straight about this former ballplayer and longtime owner. And in the foreword to the book, written by historian Bob Hoey, there's a lovely stream of hatred spewed at Comiskey across multiple pages. But the hatred isn't from Bob Hoey. Hoey quotes well-known writers ripping apart Charles Comiskey. For example, quote, in Ken Burns' baseball documentary, Daniel Okrent said the White Sox players were abused horribly by Charles Comiskey, who was a man of small mind, tight fist, and nasty temperament. Quote, Bill James, in his historical baseball abstract, wrote that the arch-villain of this villainous era was Charles Albert Comiskey. Put Joe Jackson in the Hall of Fame? How about if we kick Comiskey out? Quote, paleontologist and baseball fan Stephen J. Gould wrote that Sox owner Charles Comiskey was not only the meanest skinflint in baseball, but a man who could cruelly flaunt his wealth, while treating those who brought it to him as peons. Quote after quote describes Charles Comiskey as a miser, as a miserable Dickensian beast, equal to or even worse than Ebenezer Scrooge. And there's a fantastic story that anchors this perception. Star pitcher Eddie Cicotte earned a salary in 1919 of $5,000, but Comiskey promised a bonus of $10,000 if Cicotte won 30 games, which is ridiculous, right? Who wins 30 games? Well, with a few starts left in the season, Cicotte had amassed 29 wins. And then manager Kid Gleason, at the order of Charles Comiskey, benched Cicotte for the remainder of the season so that he wouldn't get his bonus. As a story, it's very effective in making you hate Charles Comiskey. The only problem is it's a lie. It's a lie that Elliot Asanoff created in his book, 8 Men Out. And it's a lie you can still find all over the internet. If you look up Charles Comiskey on Wikipedia, you'll find it there. It's also right there in a Bleacher Report article from 2011. But according to Michael Halpert in an article on SABR, there's no evidence that Cicotte was denied a chance to win 30 games. The manager, Kid Gleason, wanted to rest Cicotte's overworked arm because he needed to rely on Cicotte for the World Series. Also, in Cicotte's contract, there's no mention of a bonus clause. Now, there was a White Sox pitcher, Lefty Williams, who did have a bonus clause in his contract in 1919. In fact, he had two, $375 if he won 15 games, and an additional $500 if he won 20 games. Well, Williams won 23 games and received both bonuses from Comiskey. As Bob Hoey explained in his foreword, nearly all of the quotes and descriptions of Comiskey can be traced back to Elliot Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out. In terms of Comiskey's cheapskate ways, writer Michael Halpert said this, quote, while the myth that Comiskey stiffed Eddie Cicotte out of a bonus has been discredited, his reputation as a skinflint is still strong, and for good reason. However, when put into perspective, Comiskey treated his players better than most owners. So while he was cheap relative to today's standards, He was relatively generous for his day. End quote. But this is the problem we have with historical figures, right? We judge them based on our own standards today. And then the emotions and the emotional language of that misplaced judgment gets passed along. That's what happened with 8 Men Out. It came out in 1963, already filled with misplaced assumptions and straight up lies. And then people read the book, and decade after decade, they continued to judge, forgetting that they were from a different time. And all of a sudden, Charles Comiskey is a fire breathing beast. Whether we like it or not, historical figures lived at the time they lived. And rated among his contemporaries in terms of fiscal generosity, Charles Comiskey was not Ebenezer Scrooge at the beginning of A Christmas Carol. He was Scrooge at the end, handing out bags of gold like it was confetti. Remember how Jacob Pomerinke said the White Sox had one of the highest overall salaries in the league? Well, in fact, they had the highest in all of baseball. In his article, How Cheap Was Charles Comiskey? Salaries and the Black Sox, Halpert goes into great detail about the actual salaries of the players. Are you ready for this? Eddie Collins was the highest paid second baseman in the major leagues. Ray Schalk was the highest paid catcher in the majors. Buck Weaver was the second highest paid third baseman, and Shoeless Joe Jackson was the fifth highest paid outfielder. And among pitchers, Eddie Seacott was near the top as well. As Bob Huey put it, there were many players on other teams at these same positions who were better, but who were paid less. Not only were the White Sox not underpaid, but when including end of year bonuses, the White Sox had the highest payroll and highest average player salary in all of baseball. That's number one out of 16 teams. So, how does your perception change when you learn that the highest paid players in all of baseball decided to cheat so that they could make even more money? If you think this show's worth $1, please donate at the website midnightlibraryofbaseball.com or through Podbean. You can also leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. Okay, back to the show. So, how does your perception change when you learn that the highest paid players in all of baseball decided to cheat so that they can make even more money? Now it seems just like a matter of greed. But there's another aspect here that came out during my conversation with Bill Lamb. Can you talk a little bit about Comiskey and the players and in all these areas of what led to them cheating was this detachment that you describe?
I think what happened was that over the years, Charles Comiskey was an excellent ball player himself in the 1880s, grew distant from his players, and that they no longer had attachment to him. They were professionals playing for a livelihood rather than for any sense of personal loyalty.
I really like Lamb's take on this. Here we have an owner who's paying his players top dollar. But what's missing is the human element, the personal connections, to have, if not love or friendliness, at least respect. But Comiskey spent his time trying to please the press and the fans. I can't help make the family connection here to the parent who gives their children every material need and luxury, but doesn't actually connect on an emotional level, and what that can do to the relationship. And this isn't a judgment because Comiskey was a product of his time, but I'm talking about possible causality. What led to what? And here, as Lamb puts it, if your owner pays you more money than any other owner on any other team, it still doesn't prevent you from wanting to screw him over. And it wasn't just coldness. During World War One, there was a general sentiment that players should do their part like everyone else. Well, some White Sox players didn't want to go to war, and Charles Comiskey didn't like it. From Bill Lamb.
When World War One came around and players were subjected to military service, Comiskey expressed his admiration for those who enlisted, like Eddie Collins or Jim Scott, and his disdain for those who took jobs in defense industry plants to avoid military service. He, like many people of the era, considered them slackers, and he publicly expressed that disdain on several occasions. Nevertheless, when the war was over and 1919 came around, he took the players back onto his roster, and notwithstanding whatever personal sentiment he may have had about their activities during the war. And
Well,
that includes Jackson and Lefty Williams and Happy Felsch and Bird Lynn, a substitute catcher, among others.
if we interpret a little bit here, we can see Comiskey compensating his players generously, but otherwise it looks like he's tossing bundles of cash and walking away. There's no attention, no praise, no respect, no humanity. They're a commodity, a well paid commodity, but a commodity all the same. Now, there's certainly a tipping point number where a dollar amount would most likely prevent gambling, but the players who decided to fix the series were not there. And even though Comiskey was paying well in comparison to other owners of other teams, the overall pay structure in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was a huge sore spot for players. And here we have an interesting time in history. Baseball is enormously popular. An emerging middle class is paying to attend games, and this is a big deal. In his book, How Baseball Happened, Thomas Gilbert is perplexed at why more historians don't mention the growth of the middle class, known at the time as the emerging urban bourgeois, as a fundamental cause of fans. As Gilbert notes, spectators and fans are not at all the same thing. And in the mid to late 1800s, this is the first time that you have sports fans in America. And in the early 1900s, they're flocking to watch baseball games. So many people are making a lot of money. But the main draw, the players, while they're making good money, are not making great money. Now, if there was a unified players' strike in, say, 1905 or 1910, would these new generation of fans accept replacement players? Or would the owners be forced to give in? This happened on a small scale in one team, but not on a large scale to really see what would have happened. So, for most players who were disgruntled, dissatisfied, cheating remained on the table. I recently spoke with author Charles Fountain, who said this about the issue. Quote, in the 21st century, free agency and $100 million contracts leave players vulnerable to the temptation of performance enhancing drugs. In the Black Sox day, the reserve clause and depressed salaries left players vulnerable to the temptation of gambling and game fixing. End quote. From today's standpoint, it seems like a pretty simple solution to avoid the game fixing, at least, from the owner's perspective. But it didn't change. Can you introduce yourself and the book that you wrote?
Yeah, my name's Charles Fountain, and I am the author of The Betrayal, the 1919 World Series and the Birth of Modern Baseball.
And so, do you see the 8 men out as guinea pigs? And unfortunate, it had to happen to somebody, and it happened to them, but it could have happened much earlier.
It could have happened much earlier and should have happened much earlier. I write in one chapter about a legendary fixer by the name of Hal Chase,
Hmm.
who was an incandescent talent. He played for the New York Highlanders, the American League predecessor of the Yankees, and for a couple of other teams, and might have been a Hall of Famer were it not for the fact that he were an inveterate game fixer, that he fixed games for friends, he fixed games for profit, he fixed games just for the fun of it. And that most people who played with him were aware of it. Many of the owners and managers that owned the club that he played for and managed the club that he played for were aware of it or highly suspicious of it, but did nothing. This was the pattern of organized baseball in really the several decades before the Black Sox, but particularly since the merger of the American National Leagues in 1903 and the establishment of the National Commission.
It's interesting to look at the problems owners were having in the 1900s and 1910s in not paying enough, because the problem really started when they used to pay too much. As soon as professional baseball teams began to form and salaries were doled out in the late 1800s, owners paid more and more for better players. I mean, it was kind of the Wild West. And in an article for the Economic History Association, Michael Halpert points out how the owners in the 1870s, through their wish to get the best players, created a Frankenstein's monster situation. Quote, teams competed so fiercely for players that they regularly raided each other's rosters. It was not uncommon for players to jump from one team to another during the season for a pay increase. This not only cost team owners money, but also created havoc with the integrity of the game, as players moved among teams, causing dramatic midseason swings in the quality of teams. End quote. So this was a real problem, and you can see the panic from the owner's perspective. But of all the possible solutions, owners in 1879 came up with the stifling reserve clause. From Charles Fountain in his book The Betrayal, quote, the owners agreed to add a provision to the standard player contract, which would hold the players in reserve, meaning that after the contract period was over, the player would be prohibited from negotiating or signing with any other league team so long as his original team held him in reserve. The reserve clause would be the core of the professional baseball business model for the next century. End quote. So, as a player, once your contract is up, you can't go somewhere else. And you can't leverage your performance for a higher salary by creating competition. The only thing you can do is play or quit. And sometimes, seeing no other choice, players quit. Players like Sam Crawford and Joe Tinker sat out entire seasons in order to get more money because it's all they could do. This feels so human, so totally reactionary versus proactive. Instead of really thinking out a solution that worked for everyone, you have an unplanned system that spirals out of control. And then you have an overreaction, which is the reserve clause. But in this case, the overreaction resulted in huge financial benefits for the owners. So why would they ever want to change? And here's where we come back to reality in the early 1900s. But reality is different depending on who you're talking to. For the time period, major league players were making a lot of money compared to the average American. They were making enough to be grateful. After all, they weren't mining coal or laying railroad track all day. They were getting paid to play a game that most of them loved, a game that millions of Americans would have killed to get paid to play. And it's partly this truth that led to the rage and heartbreak in 1921. This feeling of, you had so much and you still cheated. Well, could you? But unfortunately, this isn't how humanity works. It's all relative. Once you're in a situation for a while, it loses the sheen, for many at least. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the pyramid are the basic needs: food, water, shelter. As you meet the needs of that layer, you forget about that layer and move on to the next level and worry about that. There's safety, then love and belonging. And as you go higher, there's self respect and status. And finally, self actualization. The rub here is that if you can achieve self actualization, you probably won't care as much about some of the lower levels. But you have to get there. At first, players making it to the big leagues in the 1900s would have been thrilled. Even at this time, it was highly competitive and would have taken a lot to get to the majors. I'm sure for most rookies, it was a dream come true to not only play a game you love at the highest level, to not only have thousands of people come out and cheer you on, but to also get paid to do this wonderful, fun thing. It's heaven, but heaven wears off. What seemed like a dream becomes normalized, and when you wake up from the dream, you realize you're trapped on a team until the king in the high tower says you can go. And now you have a family and mouths to feed and a mortgage. And if you break a finger or leg, you might lose that income. But when we return to Maslow's pyramid, these players have their basic needs met. They're safe, but they're still working on status, respect, and belonging. And from a player's perspective, I'm the star, not the owner. People come to watch me, and there are other people around me making more money than me. That's not fair. And even though I'm the ball player, getting paid to play a game I love, all these different factors start to nag on me day after day until the resentment and bitterness build. This is the reality of being human, and this is the reality of being a ball player in the early 20th century. And within this system of thinking, fixing games was seen as a necessary countermeasure to the unfairness of the way baseball was structured. And it was a countermeasure that was mostly accepted. I was trying to think of an equivalent today of something that's a crime that some people would feel guilty about doing, but others have no problem with, and nobody's really cracking down on the perpetrators. I eventually came up with stealing office supplies. A lot of people do it, and you know you're not supposed to, but a lot of the time, nobody cares. And it may seem like a little thing, but over time, stealing enough pens and staplers and copy paper can add up. But again, it seems like no big deal. You've probably taken a pen or two from work over the course of your life. I know I have. To me, it felt like an implicit agreement. Yeah, we know we're not technically supposed to, but nobody cares. Taking this way of thinking one step further, I might even think I'm allowed to take that pen, even expected to take that pen. This mindset may sound hard to believe when tied to gambling and baseball, but the ringleaders of the 1919 World Series fix, first baseman Chick Gandil and pitcher Eddie Seacott, had every reason to believe nobody would care, because for nearly 20 years, nobody had. Remember, as Charles Fountain explained, chronic gambler Hal Chase did everything but walk into the owner's office and admit his game fixing. In 1903, the National Commission was formed as the governing body of Major League Baseball. It was created to handle all legal and ethical matters that were too big for individual teams to deal with. And that first year, the commission was tested, and they failed miserably. And this failure set the tone for the next 20 years. In 1903, Cubs pitcher Jack Taylor supposedly threw several games against the White Sox. Hearing about this, Cubs owner James Hart traded Taylor, at which point Taylor was heard saying, quote, "Why should I have won? I got $100 from Hart for winning, and I got $500 for losing." End quote. And remember, the team Taylor was pitching against was the Chicago White Sox, who were owned in 1903 by Charles Comiskey. In his book, Turning the Black Sox White, author Tim Hornbaker paints a picture of a fuming, outraged Comiskey who is furious that Cubs owner James Hart didn't do more to call out and punish Jack Taylor for cheating. From Hornbaker's book, Comiskey reacted strongly to Hart's inaction. He shouted, quote, "I have filed charges against Hart and demand that some sort of punishment be handed to him for injuring the reputation of my ball club and the game itself. I will push this case against Hart to the limit." End quote. These are early days in Major League Baseball. The American League joined the National League in 1903, and the National Commission was formed that same year. This is the time to establish healthy ways of doing things before everyone starts to get settled. And American League President Van Johnson was equally outraged. And keep this name in mind, Van Johnson, because Johnson and Comiskey were good friends in 1903. But later their blood feud would lead to the downfall of 8 White Sox players and Charles Comiskey. But in 1903, Comiskey and Johnson pushed the issue of Jack Taylor's game fixing to the National Commission. There was a trial of sorts. Cubs owner James Hart got involved and submitted 3 affidavits from 3 people who heard Taylor say he was paid $500 to lose. As further evidence, Taylor's performances during these games were noticeably bad. But he basically said he played poorly because he was up all night partying. In the end, the National Commission dismissed the charges of game fixing, but fined Taylor $300 for his general bad habits. This was the precedent. From what they learned, the public didn't like it. Many people involved in the game didn't like it. Pittsburgh Pirates secretary W.H. Locke, when he heard of the exoneration of Jack Taylor, was clearly angry. And this right here is a great bit of historical prophecy, like the soothsayer stopping Julius Caesar and crying about the Ides of March. In a letter, W.H. Locke said that the price of the National Commission's inaction was going to be high, meaning players and gamblers were now going to take advantage of this toothless governing body until things got out of hand. And Locke was dead on. For the next 16 years, players fixed games with impunity. To be clear, it wasn't happening everywhere. Many players did seem to have a moral compass, but Hal Chase was not one of them. In 1918, just before the Black Sox scandal, Hal Chase, game fixer extraordinaire, went too far. Christy Mathewson, one of the best pitchers of all time, and a manager in 1918, caught Chase red-handed. Mathewson was seen as one of the most upstanding guys of the time, and he tried to suspend Chase for his game fixing, but the National Commission overturned the suspension. So Hal Chase went to the New York Giants, where, maybe even before he unpacked his bags, Chase started up a new game fixing ring with the Giants players. When Christy Mathewson found out what Chase was doing with the Giants, the normally mild mannered gentleman had an outburst. Damn them, he said. They deserve it. By they, Mathewson was referring to the National Commission. Imagine for a second you're leaving work for the day. You think about your desk at home and you see 3 pens on the table. You scoop up the pens without even thinking about it until a police officer stops you at the door and sends you to jail. And the court sentence you receive is 3 years in prison. This is an extreme example, but for the 8 men out who fixed the World Series, immoral as their act may have been, a thunderbolt from Zeus himself couldn't have shocked them more than the decision handed down in 1921 by the new commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Here's the thing about this story. It has naive and doe-eyed written all over it. It's such a mess because it's an egregious denial of humanity. I remember as a kid watching the old black and white movies. I didn't know anything about the 1930s or 40s or 50s, but based on these movies, the world sure seemed pure and innocent because that's how they wanted us to see it. That's how owners and the press wanted the common man to see sports and baseball in 1919. But that's not reality, and that's not humanity. If we can accept that society is always heavily flawed, then we can agree that within organizations, you typically can't leave it up to people to do the right thing, because it only takes one. But the truth, according to Charles Fountain, is general awareness by owners in baseball, but at the same time, an overwhelming effort to deny. From Fountain.
The owners didn't want to know the extent to which game fixing might be going on, and they certainly didn't want the public to know that there was evidence or proof of any game fixing, because that would have been damaging to the game of baseball and damaging to the box office.
Did they want to take care of it themselves, though? To know so that because they were invested, just like Comiskey was in winning games and winning titles and creating a dynasty. It's interesting because he then paid his players even better the next year. And so, where's the in-house cleanup so that it's not damaging their
Well,
team.
the sort of flippant answer to this is that all of the owners put their hands over their ears and sang la. They didn't want to know. Rumors of impropriety were not good for the game. But to investigate those rumors and proving them to be true would have been ruinous for the game.
So, yes, there are decades of build-up to the 1919 World Series fix. And the answer to the question, why do it, might now seem obvious. But there's more when we come back to this central issue of what it means to be human. Because being human comes with happiness and excitement, but it also comes with other, less appreciated qualities. If Hal Chase was the poster child for obsessive, in your face game fixing, then White Sox first baseman Chick Gandil, the supposed ringleader of the entire scandal, was the poster child for bitterness, resentment, and greed. And to accomplish his bitter vendettas, Gandil would drag down 7 players, the team owner, and the institution of baseball. That's quite a wake of destruction. Next time, in episode 2, more myths debunked.
Watergate might have equaled the level of impact on the American public that the Black Sox scandal did. And you compare the two, one threatened the game of baseball, the other threatened the Constitution and the democracy that we've got. And I think you could argue that as a visceral impact on the American public, the World Series scandal is bigger.
Next time on the Midnight Library of Baseball. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Special thanks to Bill Lamb, Charles Fountain, and Jacob Pomerinke. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.